Welcome, gentle reader, to this episode of Everything is Everything. Amit Varma has just insulted me. He has claimed that I am stupid and he is creative. Amit, in any decent age, I would have slapped you across the face with a glove and we would have done 50 paces and a duel with rusty guns that barely aim accurately. But still, like, this is an affront. What do you mean?
Gentle readers, I want you to consider this, that he has just threatened me with physical violence. So much talk about the coercion of the state, monopoly on violence. Are you the state that you can threaten me with violence
Men
like
of
this?
honor resort to duels.
So here's what I meant. We are both stupid and we are both creative. In fact, we are both creative because we are both stupid. Now, here's the thing. The human brain functions under a constraint. We simply do not have the processing capacity to take in all the beautiful complexity of the world. The world is deeply complex. We cannot possibly figure out all of it or grok all of it, right? And therefore, what do? Typically, you would expect that we would flounder or follow biological imperatives and not have a deeper sense of the world. But we do. Why? Because we are creative. We tell stories to explain the world, and these stories are necessarily simpler than the world itself, because how could they be not? But they are useful, right? Some are true and useful. None can be completely true, and therefore all are false in a sense. But they are useful. That's how we navigate the world. We tell stories about the world, which get closer and closer to an approximation of the truth. And that's how we communicate. And out of this constraint of our stupidity, not yours, Ajay Shah. In fact, it's stupid of you to think I would call you stupid of all people. Out of this shared stupidity arises our creativity and our storytelling. And so the theme of today's episode is how constraints can often lead to explosions of creativity, and constraints can often be a damn good thing.
There's a direct analogy between your use of the word stories and the scientists' use of the word model. Okay, they are the same. There's no difference between the two. Scientists make models of the world, and there's no difference, there's no daylight between the two conceptions. The great statistician George Box has a nice bumper sticker version. All models are wrong, some models are useful. Okay, Amit, tell us about models.
No, I will not tell you about models. In fact, none of the people I'm talking today is a model per se in the fashion model sense, but they are all models for us to aspire to. But I want to tell you stories about constraints and how out of constraints you can often have great creativity. And in the course of this episode, what I'm also going to do, gentle readers, is give recommendations, because there has been a constant complaint in past episodes that you guys don't give enough recommendations. In fact, last week you hijacked one of my recommendations, Derek and the Dominoes Leila, which is very sad and a low blow. I didn't expect this of you. I have to say it was quite creative, anything but stupid, but deeply devious. Nevertheless, I want to start today with an artist whose work I've recommended before here. I think in our inflation targeting episode, which our good friend Vaishnav Vyas refers to as the inflammation targeting episode, I had recommended the great Joni Mitchell album Blue. So I want to talk about Joni Mitchell here. Two things happened to Joni Mitchell when she was 9 years old, right? The first of them, and we don't know how much it shaped her, the first of them was she started smoking. But she always claimed that her voice, which is a beautiful, gorgeous voice, had nothing to do with her smoking, and it doesn't sound like it did. So leave that aside. This is just sort of not causal of anything important in any way. But the second thing was she got polio. And when she got polio, she, for a long period of time, lost the use of her left hand, or it became substantially weaker. Now, this is a person you will note who wants to do music. In fact, she later said about her polio that it made me have an inner life and it turned me into an artist, because you have polio, you're not playing that much with the other kids, maybe you miss some school, it just changes everything. And then she started learning music. But the point is, how do you play the guitar if your left hand is not able to do the things that you're normally supposed to do, and learn the traditional way? And what she did was, rather than use it as an excuse not to learn the guitar, or rather than use it as an excuse to just learn other stuff, because because she was a fine pianist as well, and she could play other instruments. But rather than give up the guitar for that reason, she just became creative, and she found creative ways to use her left hands, which did not involve some of the things that she found difficult. She came up with 50 alternative chord tunings, which is pretty crazy. Like one of her early mentors, so to say, David Crosby, once remarked that when I discovered her, she just blew my mind with all the alternative tunings that she was experimenting with. I mean, so was I, but it was natural to her, because what she would often do is she has a chord in her head and she's trying to play it, and she's not playing the regular tuning. So what she would do is she would take the tuning fork and she would just move it around and mess around with different strings till she arrived at the chord that she wanted to play. So like this, she got to know her guitar much more intimately than someone trained in a familiar way might be. The instrument wasn't just a traditional tuning or the handful of other tunings you might learn. It had endless possibilities. She often said that, in the six strings of the guitar, she would often find an entire orchestra with the top three strings being like the horn section and so on and so forth down the line. So her whole approach to the instrument, the way she viewed it, was really different. And she would in fact refer to the unusual chords that she would play and discover as chords of inquiry. And if you listen to her albums, her music is really different. It's I first heard her described as a folk musician, but she's not quite folk. She's definitely not quite blues. She dabbled a lot in jazz, and if you listen to Blue, it just sounds like very different from even other music that seems to fall in the genre. And part of it is just the way that she's playing the guitar, which is so unusual. She's considered one of the most creative guitar players of all time. She was just different from everyone else. You'll look at songs like All I Want, Little Green, River, just brilliant stuff. And there are many other songs like A Case of You, where I also love the way that she's used the piano. So that's sort of my first example and my first recommendation, that I would say that just listen to everything Joni Mitchell has done, starting with Blue, and think that had she not got polio at age 9, she might have learned to play the guitar normally and might not have experimented so much. And then the whole palette of possibilities open to her is suddenly constrained and is suddenly really different. And therefore, in a sense, constraint was a blessing to us. I wouldn't say to her, because no one should get polio, etc., and suffer the way she undoubtedly did. But it's a blessing to music because it forced a person into going into different directions and doing interesting things.
And at the risk of sugary platitudes, this is just so inspiring for the people who have constraints. Too often around us in India, we have people who will give you 20 reasons why X can't be done. But actually, the possibilities, the creativity, the imagination in each of us is something prodigal. And, we've just got to push ourselves and try harder rather than complain that I don't have this and I don't have that.
I'll riff off this and I'll say that a common constraint people often talk about, because I teach my online writing course, I've had more than 2,800 students so far. A common constraint they'll speak about is that, oh, I just don't have the time. I'm so busy, there's work. And the women have a deeper problem with this, right? Because women are often packing in a lot more than the men, in the sense they might go to office, they might have a career, but they go home, they cook. If they have kids, they have to look after the kids. There is motherhood is deeply difficult. And the inspiring story I tell them is a story of the writer Shivani. Shivani was a legendary Hindi writer from the middle of the 20th century. And I've had episodes with both her daughters, Mrinal Pandey and Ira Pandey, and with her nephew, who was like a son to her, Pushpesh Pant. And I remember Mrinalji telling me about how Shivani ji would write. And she would say that, we would all be having dinner, her sisters and the kids and the husband and so on and so forth. And Shivani would just have finished serving everyone. She's made the food, she served everyone. And then at some point, she'd just sit down and she'd start writing. And the family knew that you don't disturb her when she's writing, let her write. And so they would give her that grace. But the point is, she would not wait to take a vacation and go somewhere and write in a conducive atmosphere. She would not wake up 4 hours early so she could write in the quiet of the day. She would realize that these are my constraints. I have a family that makes a lot of noise. Her husband needs feeding, the children need looking after. And whatever little scraps of time I get within that, I will just sit and write. And all the noises around her, the kids are eating around her. One kid might be pushing another the kid. I don't know if Mrinalji and Iraji did that kind of thing, but they're both quite fiery in their old age at least, or rather in their years of wisdom. One should not use terms like old age. So, that is inspiring to me, that everyone has constraints. At some point, you're alive, you're breathing, you're lucky, just stop complaining and get on with it.
Yes.
Joni Mitchell used to call herself a painter derailed by circumstance. She loved painting, but she never really took it up. She went into music, but all her album covers are by herself. So even if she was a painter derailed by circumstance, she did get to do some painting. The second person I want
I'm
to
a
talk
lonely
about.
painter. I live in a box of paints.
There you go. So well done. So one of your favorite songs is a Joni Mitchell song, right? Both sides now. Yeah, lovely. So the second person I want to talk about is a painter who refused to be derailed by circumstance, and is a painter who actually began life with a similar circumstance to Joni Mitchell. I'm talking about Frida Kahlo. At the age of 6, Frida Kahlo got polio, right? And when she got polio at the age of 6, like Joni Mitchell, you will remember, got it at the age of 9, Frida Kahlo's right leg was much weaker than her left. She missed a few months of school. So again, she is lonely. She doesn't get to play with the other kids. This affects her. And you miss a couple of years at that phase, it becomes really difficult. I think she missed a few months of schooling with the kids and all of that. And it kind of, scarred her, and she would refer to it in the years later. And that's at the age of 6. At the age of 18, when she is moving towards becoming a doctor on her way to medical school, in fact, she is traveling in a wooden bus which collides with a metal rail car, and it is a terrible accident, and there is actually a railing which kind of comes through the bus and goes through her pelvis. Her spine is dislocated and injured. In fact, through her life, she has to go through 32 surgeries. Her pelvis is hurt, her hips are hurt, and she is bedridden at this moment in time. And her dreams of becoming a doctor are pretty much done, because she will spend a long time in bed, not just a few months following this, but also for different periods of her life. But her parents, God bless their souls, though we don't believe in God, but flying spaghetti monster should bless their souls, decide to encourage her habit of painting. So what they do is that as she lies in bed, they rig up an easel on which she can paint, and they put a mirror there. They put a mirror there so that she can look at herself. And any of you familiar with art or familiar with Frida Kahlo's work will know that her self-portraits are legendary. And in a sense, you wonder about how much of it was this, that she is lying for weeks and months on this bed, unable to move anything except her hands. And there's an easel there where she can paint. And there's a mirror so that she can look at herself. And there's a great quote from her I'm going to read out now. I paint self-portraits because I am so often alone, because I am the person I know best. Right? So there she is, and this shapes what she does. She starts using bright, vivid colors. Her style is shaped by this. We'll link to videos that kind of talk about this. But I am so impressed by the fact that she turns this constraint into something that can help her express herself and become creative, this constant focus on herself. And it is not just that she is painting self-portraits because all she has is a mirror. She is not out there in the rest of the world meeting other people during this time, so that is all that she can do. And throughout her life, what she does is that she uses these constraints, these medical constraints, to to create her art. There is a famous 1944 painting, The Broken Column, which comes about after a spinal surgery goes wrong, and you can see it now on the screen, and it's incredibly powerful. And there are various other paintings by her which depict what she went through. There was a point of time where for a fair period of time, she had to wear corsets made of plaster. There was no other way for her to keep herself together given the condition of her spine. So what do? Corsets made of plaster, you would, like, if I had to live in under a constraint like that, I would just be, it would be so dark, I would feel so hopeless. But she painted those. She painted those. She was always painting the equipment around her. She was painting all of these constraints. And I find that an incredibly sort of inspiring story, that she could have let all of this get her down, but she didn't. And she lived a full life in many ways. She didn't spend all her life in bed. She had a tumultuous marriage with Diego Rivera. They cheated on each other, then they split up, and then they remarried and each other. So there's all kinds of stuff happening there. She is living life to the full. But her interior life is very much shaped by the constraints and the time that she is forced to spend with herself. And you wonder if a constraint like that, perhaps not under the circumstances that she went through, but you wonder if a constraint like that, where you're forced to spend time with yourself, is in some ways a blessing. You know, when we were growing up, Ajay Shah, there was no internet, there were no mobile phones. You couldn't distract yourself by looking into a black mirror. You had to spend some time with yourself, right? You had to spend some time engaging with the real world. I did a lovely episode with Sara Rai, Munshi Premchand's granddaughter, who's a brilliant writer. She's got a great book of essays called Raw Umber. And in her episode with me, when she was talking about her childhood, everything was so vividly described, right? And I was like, Sarah, what's going on? Like, you know, this is an incredible memory. Are you able to look back and reconstruct all of this, or were you always noticing stuff? And she was like, Amit, और क्या करते हम? कुछ था ही नहीं. पूरा दिन तो आप किताब नहीं पढ़ सकते. You will look around, you will look at the grass, you will look at the leaves, you will take it in. And I wonder in modern times if, the absence of the constraint called nothing to do, has made us into creatures who are going from sensation to sensation and not spending enough time with ourselves. And perhaps we need to spend more time with ourselves like Frida Kahlo did. There's another great quote by her that I love. Feet, what do I need you for when I have wings to fly? Yeah, and this might sound a little cheesy, but see the context, see who's saying it. It's not cheesy. It is so incredibly inspiring that, someone could just break away and, unlike Joni Mitchell, refuse to be constrained by circumstance, not become a painter constrained by circumstance, but just say that I'm going to do what I'm going to do.
On the way the world has changed, in the upper class in India today, there's plenty of resources, and we see parents buying a room full of toys for their kids, and the kids seem to like get bored of each toy within 3 days, and then there's a treadmill where you go to the next toy. And there was something very different when you and I grew up in deprivation, where basically there was like one tennis ball in a group of 20 people, and everybody's intelligence and imagination and creativity had to be challenged on using stones and trees and shrubs and that one tennis ball to do fun things all day. But it has its own charm, and I think it wakes up the mind in interesting ways.
And when you say about playing and when you say about ball, it reminds me of another story. Now, this is from memory. So I hope I'm remembering the person right. But Sunil Gavaskar, right? His impeccable straight drives along the ground, the brilliant control that he had over the ball, and that except at the very last part of his career. And I still remember the 1987 World Cup, where he made 100 in his second last game against New Zealand, hitting even Chatfield all over the park, where he lofted the ball. But otherwise he was known for keeping the ball on the ground, and that came out of the gully cricket that he played. That in that gully you could not break a freaking window. If you broke a freaking window, they would take your ball or bat away. You would not be able to play. So out of that constraint that I can't break any of these windows, he learned correct technique and how to play the ball along the ground. And I find that such a delightful story.
Next story.
So the next story is actually a story. It's a book. I'm going to read out some lines from the book. I want you to identify the book if you can. The book, as all viewers can see on the screen, but you can't see because you can't see the screen. This is a little bit like chess players, that when two chess players are playing a match, all the viewers can see the computer evaluation except the chess players themselves, right? So they are the two chutias who don't know the right move. Everybody else does. So similarly, I am now going to show readers something on the screen, gentle readers, but you are not going to be able to see it. But it's a still from a book where we have a character called Sam I Am, and he's speaking to someone, and these are the lines where the person he's speaking to says, "That Sam I am, that Sam I am, I do not like that Sam I am." And then Sam I Am says, "Do you like green eggs and ham?" And the reply is, I do not like them, Sam I am. I do not like green eggs and ham. And then Sam I am says, would you like them here or there? And then the gentleman replies, I would not like them here or there. I would not like them anywhere. I do not like green eggs and ham. I do not like them, Sam I am. Sam I am continues, would you like them in a house? Would you like them with a mouse? And the answer is, I do not like them in a house. I do not like them with a mouse. I do not like them here or there. I do not like them anywhere. I do not like green eggs and ham. I do not like them. Sam I am.
That's the
And so it goes on.
That's the Dr. Seuss.
That's a Dr. Seuss. Dr. Seuss, of course, apparently everyone says Dr. Seuss is supposed to be correct, but he pronounced his own name Seuss, and he said Zeus is acceptable, thereby implying Seuss is not acceptable. So I shall attempt to say Seuss if I remember it. His real name was Theodore Geisel. And this is from a book called Green Eggs and Ham. Do you like green eggs and ham?
Yeah, I'd be willing to try.
Or do you think they are a sham? So here's the deal. And what I said is actually wrong because sham does not appear in the book. Here's the deal. Dr. Seuss's publisher was a gentleman named Bennett Cerf. Bennett Cerf was one of the founders of Random House, a legendary figure in his own right. And Bennett Cerf went to him and I think offered him some money or offered him a bet. But the idea was you have to write a full book using only 50 words. Which is not that the book is 50 words long, it can be as many words as you want, but the total number of words you use in the book is only 50. You can't use more than that. And Dr. Seuss said, Ek to he must have thought that what a bleepia challenge. And the second thing he must have thought is, Main karega. Right? And he actually did it. I think he kept a chart to note how many words he's using. And he actually wrote the whole damn book in 50 words. And in any case, through his oeuvre, I think Dr. Seuss is noted for not using too many words, as it were. And I think this is, again, a delightful example of using the constraints to come up with something beautiful. I think you were thoroughly entertained by what I was reading out to you. Though part of it could have to do with my charms, but it also illustrates another principle I make, that my writing students will often ask me that, boss Amit, my vocabulary isn't great, what should I do, etc., etc. To which I have two answers. The practical answer is that the more you read, your vocabulary gets better. The only way you really improve it is by reading a lot. There's no other way to do it. But the second thing I say is that your vocabulary is enough. Because I do not believe, Ajay Shah, that any writer needs a greater vocabulary than her readers. You know why? Think about it. You want your readers to understand what you are writing. So your vocabulary is not the limitation. Your readers, the words they know are enough, and you can work within that. So I would say to anyone watching this show that if you worry about your vocabulary, I am telling you 100% confidence your vocabulary is enough to write well. And that's a great example of that. And throughout writing, you find other examples of this. For example, Agatha Christie had dysgraphia and perhaps even dyslexia, right? She had a trouble with words. And her way past this was not to say that, I shall not, I'm a writer restrained by circumstance, or it wasn't to say that I won't write, I'll do something else, maybe I'll learn the guitar and find 50 alternative tunings. It wasn't that. Her way was to come up with a writing style that was clear and concise. Her way was to do intricate, tight plotting so there would be no confusion anywhere, and so on and so forth. So, in a sense, out of that limitation arises a style that is a feature, not a bug, because it pays an emphasis on clarity and intricate plotting and all of the things that make her work what it is. Similarly, you look at Ernest Hemingway, a model of so many people, including me, for his spare style. He's not messing around, wasting any words. And his spare style partly comes from journalism. Because journalism, you have to write on deadline. You don't have time to bullshit. You don't have time to craft perfect sentences. Cut, you're just filing dispatches. Right? Deadline hai, telex it across or whatever, and you're filing dispatches. And that forces a certain economy of prose. But economy doesn't mean that you're missing anything out. Hemingway also came up with what is known as the iceberg style. If you don't know what it is, can you guess?
1/10.
1/8. So, for an iceberg, about 1/8 of it is above water, the rest is hidden. And Hemingway's point was that only 1/8 needs to be in my story of what is really going on. And the rest can be undercurrent. The rest can be left to the reader's mind to fill it in when they go in. At one hand, Ajay Shah and Amit Varma are talking, but Ajay Shah has a certain impatient expression on his face, right? And Amit is also getting visibly nervous because he's tapping it. And that's where the rest of the iceberg comes in. What's going on? What's the backstory? Can you make out from the few words? And that's the beauty of great writing. It is not only show, don't tell, but it is show enough and no more, right? And again, that's something that Hemingway comes up with. Hemingway is also given credit for a six-word short story he did not write. It is apocryphal. There is a masterful six-word short story that originated at the beginning of the century, and those six words are for sale, baby shoes, never worn. Right? It's a masterpiece. But Hemingway was 6 years old when this was first published, so it is really unlikely Hemingway wrote it. In fact, an earlier version of this came out much before he was born. But again, it's an example of economy. And writers could often be well served by this, right? That I would often cavil back in the day. Now, I have written hundreds of columns. I've written columns for every Indian newspaper, including for and foreign publications like Wall Street Journal, Guardian, etc., etc. एंड आई वुड कैविल दैट यार 800 वर्ड में मुझे इतनी बड़ी ओपिनियन बताना है पूरी पूरी देश बदल जाएगी जब मैं अपने विचार बताऊंगा एंड यू आर गिविंग मी 800 वर्ड्स इट्स नॉट फेयर सो आई वुड राइट 1200 वर्ड्स एंड आई वुड से हाउ कैन आई कट दिस इज नॉट फेयर बट देन आफ्टर यू कट इट you realize that the stuff you cut wasn't really required. It can be done. You need that artificial constraint to get it done. Sometimes a constraint is a deadline. Douglas Adams once said, I love deadlines, especially the sound they make as they go whooshing by. Right? So deadlines are crazy. Deadlines are giving a constraint of time. And I'm like, oh my God, मैं तो thesis लिखने वाला हूँ पूरी political philosophy बदल जाएगी दुनिया में और संडे तक कैसे I need more time. But then you freaking get it done and then it's fine and it moves on in the world. And let's face it, we have written a lot, kuch nahi ukhara. It's fine. You do what you do, you move on, you learn from it. So constraints, whether they are constraints of time like deadlines or constraints of space, can often be awesome. Like I will often tell people that try writing poetry, especially poetry within a particular format like iambic pentameter, or if that's too hard, just haiku. 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables. These 3-line poems, and try writing them. And the idea is not that you should be a poet or that particular form is great. The idea is you give yourself a constraint and then you have to fit the words into that constraint. And that, makes you look at the language more closely. Like at the end of my writing course, I often give this exercise to my students where I'll give them 4 different writing prompts. But my condition will be that no adverbs or adjectives and no word with more than 2 syllables. And my point for these conditions is never that I don't like big words or I don't like adverbs or adjectives. Sometimes adverbs, so one should not use. Adjectives are sometimes okay, but 70% of the time they are wasteful. And big words, we use them all the time when we feel they are necessary. So why do I set the conditions? I set the condition because it forces them to look at their sentences carefully, to look at the language that they are using carefully. And if you apply that same care and you look at someone like a William Shakespeare, you'll find he's showing the same economy of style. Great writers through the ages, great storytellers, from a Shakespeare writing a play to Abraham Lincoln giving that Gettysburg Address in 167 words or something, whatever it was, to Ernest Hemingway doing what he's doing, to writers of our modern times, including lyricists. All the great Hindi film lyricists, Sahil Ludhianvi, Gulzar Saab, Javed Akhtar, you look at the kind of work that they have done, they are all performing to constraints. Because this is a meter, this is a music, this is where you fill it in. Constraints are bringing out, the genius in their work. Even we. Is everything, anything less than a work of art, I tell you, Ajay Shah. And yet we have the constraint that is between 60 to 90 minutes. And yet we manage to do this. Don't we manage to do this? Aren't you still watching? If you're still watching, you can't fucking diss. This is what? We are in the, this must be the 33rd minute or something of the show. So yeah, we are also operating under constraints and we are doing fine.
So, Amit, you've just segued from constraints driven by the external world, force majeure, that the acts of God, you didn't have a choice and you had polio at 9, to self-imposed constraints, where a person is choosing to play within a certain box because it makes you think in certain ways. Sometimes it may merely be a nice game, but sometimes it challenges the mind. So I think that's a nice way to think about it. Um, I was thinking of many versions of constraints, like, why would you play chess blindfold? But the moment you say this, it is irresistible. Like, my God, a human being can play chess blindfold. It's like the constraint is what brings it to life. It is completely incredible. I remember when I was hiking in the IIT days, we used to just do this silliness of making it harder. Not because we needed to, but just because it spiced up the whole thing. So one idea was, don't go wearing shoes, hike in rubber chappals. Okay, so do complex mountain hikes wearing rubber chappals. Then load up the weight, carry a really heavy load, and then hike at night, and then put it all together. So a night hike with a heavy load with rubber chappals. Just, load on the challenge, and it comes to life. It becomes more and more interesting. That otherwise it would have been something that was reasonably possible, but here suddenly the mind wakes up and says, "Oh my God, this is hard."
And another point to note is something that just struck me as you were speaking, which is that sometimes Eddie Van Halen chose to play the piano. Right now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that the guitar itself is a constraint because there are some things you can't do in it. Similarly, a keyboard is a constraint because there are some other things that you can't do in it. And this really fits more the theme of the earlier episode we had done, the changing forms of creativity, where form can determine the kind of kind of content there is. But we are all actually, without realizing it, operating under constraints. But when you fall in love with the guitar, when Eddie Van Halen first picks up the guitar, or the first time he plays Eruption, for example, he's not thinking that, oh my God, I have so many constraints. He's thinking, I have so many possibilities, right? And sometimes then after that you go on for other possibilities, he's playing the piano because that what he's got in his head demands something else. So actually everything is constrained and everything has boundless opportunity. And the question is, how do you look at it?
So is the word constraints then intimately related to the general Amit Varma theory around form?
Of course it is,
That,
because it is a formal constraint.
yeah. So, we're given a form, it's an 800 word column. We're given a form, it's a blog article. We're given a form, it's a
280 character tweet.
280 character tweet, or we're given a form, it's a 10 and a half hour seen and the unseen. And we sink deeply into that form, and then the human imagination says, what do you think I could do with that? And it is interesting and liberating to think of an experience with polio as being that sort of thing.
Absolutely.
Amit, show us such amazing stories from the world of sports.
So, from the world of sport, actually, if you think about it, the form determines content in in every sport, because the rules of the game are the constraints, right? So, for example, in a one-day match, the moment you say that you'll only have so many people in the outfield in the first 15 overs, you are immediately changing the way the game is played because you've changed the incentives. The moment you say in football, okay, there is now going to be an offside rule, you've straight away made the game different and much better. So, baseball especially is famous for this. Stephen Jay Gould has a great book on this. I've forgotten the name. I read it like 30 years ago. A brilliant book where what they do in baseball is they'll keep tinkering with little things, little changes in rule here and there, depending on how they want, depending on what they're trying to balance out within the game. In a sense, they're doing central planning, except in baseball, you actually can, because it is not unbounded complexity like the real world itself. And an example of something drastic, something brilliant, something pathbreaking that came out of a constraint is from the high jump. In 1968, in the Olympic Games, the high jump was won by a gentleman named Dick Fosbury. Right now, Dick Fosbury, before this, when he was in high school, used to suck at the high jump. He used to suck at the high jump because the traditional way of doing the high jump was something called the straddle, where, as you're seeing on the screen now, you get your body over the bar and then one leg and then the other leg. And he simply couldn't get his act together. He just didn't have that coordination. He couldn't manage this. And it was really hard for him. So he started trying other things, and initially, like all heretics, got mocked for it. And he came up with something called the Fosbury flop. This was his unique style of doing it, where he almost turns his back on the bar, like he's running towards it and then he just turns away from the bar as if he's changed his mind at the last moment. But then he goes over it in a completely different way to what anyone had done before. And this became known as a Fosbury flop, partly because of some headline which says Fosbury flops over the whatever. People compared him with a fish flopping into a boat. It was derisive. They were making fun of him. Till in 1968, he wins the Olympic gold with the Fosbury flop. And and it suddenly becomes a new norm. And today, if you look at the high jump, that's a standard technique which is taught because it is just better. But the point is, because your conventional wisdom was the way to do it is you get your body over one leg at a time. Again, look at the straddle. It just looks natural. Like ऐसे ही तो करते हैं ना. How do you jump over something? This is the instinctive way that we would probably try to jump over something. In fact, in slow motion, if we try to climb over something, this might be how we do it, or some version of this where you take one leg first, but you are basically facing the bar. And what he did was completely radical. But what he did was not because he went to first principles and he thought, okay, let me think aerodynamically, body is like this is like that, bar is there, this is the optimal way to do it. He didn't think like that. He had a constraint. He simply couldn't do the straddle. So he said, okay, I will fight the constraint and I will try some other way. And this happened to be the way that worked and changed the sport completely. And again, it's a constraint. Guy is unable to cope with the constraint. He tries something else as a way around it, and it works, and it becomes a standard. And the thing to note also here is that the success of the Fosbury flop might have been incentivized by a constraint, but the success of it was incentivized by the removal of a constraint. Because earlier, if you tried to jump like that, there was a danger that you would have a hard landing. At one point, he did have a hard landing when he was younger, and I think there was some back injury, but he got better. But then they came up with deep foam mattresses. So today you see a high jump, you jump over it and you're landing on deep foam. Whereas earlier, they either had a mound of sand or they had a much lower, much shallower foam this thing. And if you land on your back or you land on the wrong angle, you could severely hurt yourself. But the incentive changes when you have deep foam, where it doesn't really matter if you land in that manner, you're really not going to get injured. And the removal of the previous constraint, the hard ground, then enables the technique. So it is these two things happening together in a sense. But again, you look at the guy, like if I have also tried high jump in school, Ajay Shah, and let me tell you honestly, I failed at it and I gave up. And today I think of Dick Fosbury and I think, what if I had persevered? What if I had persevered, Ajay? The first Bengali gold medalist in the high jump, probably, but of course not, unless you're talking about some other kind of high jump. But again, this is, a great sporting story. And I can think of other sporting stories, but like the sporting story which every cricket fan knows, but that didn't lead to a breakthrough per se, is a story of Sachin Tendulkar when he got tennis elbow. So at one point, Sachin Tendulkar got tennis elbow. Now you will be aware, like any good Indian, except that you're not a good Indian because you don't follow cricket. But every good Indian, by the definition of that for the purpose of this chapter, is someone who follows cricket. You will know that when you're doing a cover drive, your elbow has to be at the angle across which you're hitting the ball. And if you look at replays of Sachin Tendulkar doing that, it is perfection. It is immaculate. It is geometry come to life, Ajay Shah. But then he got tennis elbow. And he never revealed the extent of it in public. But I have mutual friends with him. A very close friend of mine is a very close friend of his. And what I have sort of heard is that at one point it got so bad he could not lift a cup of tea. He could not lift a cup of tea. And he is going to Sydney to play a test match against the mighty Australians. And he can't do a cover drive. In fact, he can't drive through the offside. So what's he going to do? And Sachin Tendulkar decided that, theek hai bhai, I don't need the offside. Right? I'm going to play. And he makes a double hundred without driving through the offside even once. A double hundred against Australia, one of the strongest team in the world at that time, period. Right? And he does that. And there are many things you can say about Tendulkar which are both good and bad, but this is just extraordinary. But again, it doesn't exactly fall into our other examples because it is not like some magic innovation that comes out of nowhere. But it tells you that this is a tough constraint. You give the best batsman in the world a tennis elbow. How's he gonna play? He's got to freaking sit out till it gets better. But he goes and he plays and he makes the runs. Mind blowing.
Amit bhai, I will have you know that I have an important life story of a faintly similar nature. Okay, so I was a student at IIT, and the most important male objective of IIT students in that age was playing a computer game called Digger.
What kind, what kind of male objective is that? Shame on you. What the fuck?
Yeah. Then I broke my hand. Okay. So I had multiple compound fracture of the right arm. So I was out of business because, I'm right-handed and the right fingers were what was needed to play Digger. Further, Digger stored scores encrypted on a floppy disk. And your bragging rights entirely depended on what was that high score on a floppy disk. So this was a serious crisis. And I was stuck all by myself without the ability to play Digger, without the ability to keep up with the Joneses. And others were getting to higher and higher scores.
I want to keep this a family show, but I can't help interrupting and letting readers know that it's much better for a male engineer to injure his right hand than his left hand. But please continue.
So I was sitting on a computer keyboard, unable to use my right hand to control the keyboard. And in those days, computer games were keyboard games, there were no joysticks. So I basically had nothing better to do and I took to reading the binary. So I disassembled the compiled binary of Digger and started reading it. And I looked at it and I looked at it hundreds of times. And I knew the game intimately, of course, because I had played it with great energy and care. And then the idea dawned on me about certain regions inside the binary. It was a single file binary. There were certain regions inside the binary where the design of the floor plan of each level of Digger was stored. And I found that I could change those and save that modified binary. And suddenly my modified floor plans became available inside that modified Digger. So hell, I wrote an editor program which would edit the binary of Digger. So I had a user interface through which I could design my own floor plans. And then in that, I designed a floor plan where basically the monsters just die by themselves and you get points by just leaving the machine running all night. And the world champions at the time had like scores of 10, 20,000. And I re-emerged from my fractured right arm days with a high score of 300,000.
Ajay Shah, at one level, this might be called adapting to constraints, fancy term, but this is cheating.
Yeah.
Kya-
This is the only time in my life I've read binary. So it was the constraint. You had to read assembly. There was nothing else to do.
So you read assembly.
Yeah.
But what great innovation or invention have you come up with because you had to read assembly
Nothing.
because of this constraint?
Nothing. It was just that I had time on my hands. I had a burning passion to play the male game of IIT Bombay, which was to get a high score in Digger, and I did it.
Namsita, leave this in. Leave this entire story and let the world see what a shameless man this is. That he not only did this, but he's boasting about it as an example of responding to constraints. Ajay Shah, at one level I just lost respect for you, but at another level I gained respect for you. Well done. This is so cool.
Yes, Amit, keep going. Tell us more stories.
Actually, I just have a bunch of mini stories and I could really go on forever. But I must point out something at this point that has been remiss of me to not point out, which is that this episode is basically, even though it was my idea, it's basically constructed by me with Vaishnav and Namsita. So they are equal contributors to these stories I have related so far and I am about to relate. So they are very much co-creators of this entire episode. So credit where it is due. And these stories, frankly, were extremely inspiring for us. We were up till late last night kind of discussing these and other stories and all our constraints and your very sad constraints of intelligence and age and all of that. But despite that, you're like really doing a pretty good job. So here's additional mini story as it was. Story 1, gentleman named Spencer Silver. He works in a company called 3M, right? And Spencer Silver has decided to figure out the strongest adhesive known to man. So he's trying to find out the strongest adhesive that there possibly is. Fevikwik ka baap, as it were. But like Dick Fosbury at the high jump, he fails utterly. He can't come up with it. And in fact, one of his attempts is a spectacular failure because it is really a weak adhesive. But that weak adhesive, when he uses it, it gives him an idea. And that idea becomes a post-it note. Right now, post-it notes are absolutely freaking ubiquitous. We use them all the time. In fact, even when we don't physically use them, there will be computer design where you'll have virtual post-it notes. And that is, by the way, called skeuomorphic design. You know what skeuomorphic design means? So skeuomorphic design is that, let's say a technology comes up, but people are unfamiliar with the technology. So to make people comfortable with it, they will use design elements from the previous iteration of that thing. For example, when Apple Books first launched whatever their books app was, it looked like a physical bookshelf, so that people immediately get it that it's a bookshelf. Often when a folder in which you could save something had a floppy disk icon, if you remember. In fact, folders in Windows computers look like actual folders used to look. That, yes, that is not just an icon, there were physical things that look like that. And so that's called skeuomorphic design, that you do it to make someone comfortable with it. But it can sometimes be taken too far, and it can sometimes continue long beyond the time that it needs to be. So, so you'll see 3M sticker things on some software, which is skeuomorphic design. But actual 3M notes soon became ubiquitous in office because it is so useful. You're visiting the next cubicle where your friend Mr. Dilbert X is sitting, and you can just leave a note for them. Or you want to set a to-do list for yourself कि आज मैं ये 5 episode record करूँगा, and you put 5 post-it notes. So we've never recorded 5 in a day. I think we've done 3 in a day, right? Never 5 in a day. I have actually recorded 3 episodes of The Seen and the Unseen in a day, but this was back in the day where they were 20-30 minutes. So I rented a Bangalore studio, and this must be episode 1, 2, 3 for all I know. They were really short back in the day. So yeah, post-it notes, that's story number 1. So that brings me to the end of my first mini story.
Thinking of skeuomorphic designs, it was a shock to me rather recently when it was explained to me that in the phone there's a camera app, right? And the camera app will have a mode like portrait, and then it'll have a mode like pro. Okay, it'll have all those funny modes. So in the pro, there will be like aperture and exposure and all that. Did you know? All that is just designed to make old photographers feel comfortable. Actually, all that's going on is just image processing.
Yeah.
So nothing changes in the actual lens and the sensor and the aperture of the phone's camera. So when they show you that I'm going to do an underexposure, or you're being shown the dials that look like a camera, they're just exploiting your views of user interface to a device that has nothing to do with that world.
Not just the visual element of it, but even the sound. Like, I keep my phone on mute all the time, but when it's not on mute, when I take a picture, it goes click. Actually, there's no shutter clicking or anything like that. That just happens.
Your next story.
So my next mini story is about the great designer Coco Chanel. Right, Coco Chanel, early 20th century, is from a relatively humble family. She wants to be a fashion designer, but she does not have the means to buy fancy fabrics and silks and brocades and all of that and experiment with them. So her early experiments happen with material like jersey, which was used for making men's underwear. And she takes material like that and starts making women's garments with them, which weren't typically done because it is considered, passe and लड़के लोग की चड्डी बनती है उसके साथ. But she used them for classy women's garments, automatically also making them more affordable and more accessible because, much cheaper and so on and so forth. So that's a great example of how, what later becomes commonplace in fashion originates because of a constraint of an individual that, hey, I can't do high fashion with silks and brocades, but I can do beautiful couture with, other garments and bring them to the fore. So that's an interesting story. My next story is about a young artist called Keith Haring. I mean, he was young when he was young. He's not young now. But in the early 1980s, he was a student in New York, an art student, and he loved the idea of painting outdoors. Rather than be elitist with the art and, do a painting, sell it to a gallery, he wanted to paint outdoors. And the perfect canvas for him was almost ubiquitous and always to be found. Those days, if you would go to the subway there, you'd find that if an advertisement had expired, it would be covered up with black canvas. Right? And this was the ideal canvas, as it were, for him to just do his painting because it's not vandalism, it's not serving any purpose. The advertisement is covered, and this is a perfect way for him to do something. But a bunch of constraints come into place. He's got to hurry. He's got to get the job done before the transit police come. He's got to use material that can be used when you are in a hurry. So he starts using chalk. and he starts, building a style that is adapted to that speed and to the material and to the fact that it is public, and even to the fact that it will be taken down soon enough and it won't be there. And he comes up with all these beautiful motifs and develops a style of his own, and then later he becomes famous, and he's commissioned grand murals which will remain and stuff that transit police is not going to arrest him for. And but his style is what it is. It's developed. His motifs are, the barking dog, and there are some others are, famous, copied by others, even iconic in their own way. And it all came out of this particular constraint that, hey man, I gotta hurry and I just gotta get the job done, and chalk is the only thing that is suitable to what I'm trying to do. So this is also a story that I find interesting. And what I would tell gentle readers is, do two things. One is that I want you to put in the comments below examples that you can think of, not just people who have gone past constraints to be excellent. I think all excellent people actually have to go past some constraints or the other. But people in whose cases constraints led them into discovering something mind blowing. Like even the MacBook Air, for example. I'm not a huge Apple fan, though, except my phone, everything I use seems to be Apple now. But the MacBook Air is quite a wonder because they set themselves a constraint that this is how thin it will be, this is how light it will be. And they couldn't do that with existing technology. So then they came up with all the technological tools which make it possible, which is now all over the place. I mean, I just bought an iPad Pro, which is like, 480 grams, the 11-inch model that I have. And it's miraculous. And the point is, without that self-imposed constraint, it would not have come about, because why bother? But these one guys said, no, we are just going to keep pushing the envelope. So I think, so one, I want you to leave those comments. And two, I want you to actually sit down and actively think in the world around you, among the artists you admire, the scientists, the writers you admire, what are their constraints? And because I'm just going with it and there's no constraint for me, it's my show, I'll come up with a third thing I want you to do, which is I want you to think about the constraints in your life which have stopped you from achieving something or doing something or even attempting something, and to take that mental step, to think of Frida Kahlo in her bed with an easel racked up for her and a mirror and that solitude and a body wrecked by an old polio she had when she was 6 years old, doing what she's doing. Joni Mitchell, constantly with one hand on the tuning string, trying to find the chord that she can hear in her head. We can get past any constraints. It's just a question of inspiring yourself to do so and not letting yourself down and not getting into a vicious circle. Ajay Shah, what thoughts? What constraints of yours are you going to shrug aside now?
So first I want to be the mean Grinch and remind all of us about the place of selection bias. Millions of people were struck down by polio. On average, it was a bad thing for their lives. Some people managed to break out of the prison cell and reimagine what is the meaning of life in cool ways, and we tend to pick on their stories. So just being cautious in terms of what's possible. The second thing I want to say is the difference between the stories we have told and a mathematical view of the world. So let me first start at a simple maths version of the problem. In maths, when we do optimizations and constrained optimizations, there is an absolute black and white fact that you are given an unconstrained problem, you can get to some optimum. When constraints are introduced, if you're lucky, you'll still get back to that optimum, but in general, you will become worse. There is no way to ever become better. Okay? There's absolutely no question about this fact, this mathematical fact that constrained optimizations can sometimes match the outcome obtained from an unconstrained optimization, and in general will be a little worse, will be worse as compared to where you were. But that's not the way many stories that we have told have unfolded. And I think the key is to think out of the box. That if the optimization problem is written down, that here's your objective function, here's your constraints, you're solving this nonlinear programming, there's only one answer, and then you put on more constraints, you'll only get worse. If you respect the frame, then it's inevitable that as you layer on the constraints, it gets worse. It is human creativity. It is that divine spark where you are able to think outside the box and reimagine questions and purpose in novel ways. And then suddenly you break free from your jail cell and you're doing something different.
Absolutely. And to respond to the first point, I'm not for a moment saying polio is good or constraints are good, but that we should be inspired by these stories and try to get past these constraints. You also mentioned black and white facts. It should be noted that I am right now a black and white fact. And it is also a black and white fact, Ajay Shah, that at the end of our last episode, you promised that in this episode, you would come up with 5 recommendations. Vaishnav, I want to hear from you, hai ki nahi? Namsita, I want to hear from you, hai ki nahi?
Can you guys
Absolutely.
just I'll do this in the next because I wanted to gather up
No,
some
no, we are
stuff.
doing it now.
I
You
have
want to
some
do this in
thoughts
the
on it. I
next.
need to gather it. So we'll just
Okay, fine.
we'll
Viewers,
ignore this for
you
now.
heard him. We are
But in
not
the next
editing
step,
this.
I'm giving you 5.
We are not editing this. In the next step, you have to give us 10 then.
I have some things that I want to talk about.
But 5 or 10?
5.
6 at least.
Okay, 6.
5 for this episode, 1 for that.
6.
6 recommendations from Ajay Shah for the next episode. Thank you for watching. It's been delightful. And, we will respect the constraints of your time. And we will let you go and do amazing things. Amazing. Blow my mind.